All right, since we're already at 4 after the hour and we know from past sessions that the time flies by, I'll get us started. I want to start by saying good afternoon to everybody and welcome to what is our final installment this semester of Inspiring Conversations. I'm Tom Schreier and I'm the founding director of the Inspired Leadership Initiative here at Notre Dame. It is our program for those who have completed their chosen career and look to return to campus for an academic year to discover, discern, and design their next act. And I welcome those who are interested to look into us at nd.edu/inspired. We've spent this semester discussing transforming lives and lives transformed, with a focus on 3 critical and timely topics: pursuing a second act, the intersection of spirituality and leadership, and solving societal problems. We've been incredibly fortunate to have such great interest in this program with over 1,300 subscribers from 34 different countries. And we're extremely grateful to those who are working with us for their involvement in this series, particularly the Alumni Association and Mary Scott for all the thought and the work they've put into this platform, ThinkND, which is Notre Dame's online learning community. We hope that you found your experience as part of our community to be engaging, inspiring, and consistent with the ethos of our program and the university. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Adrienne. We are so delighted to welcome you to discuss Why Care, crafting a leadership grounded in truth and empathy. As you may have seen in the preview video on ThinkND, she's the Chief Experience Officer and a practicing neurologist at Cleveland Clinic. In this role, she also has a focus not only on the science of medicine, but also on developing authentic empathy, compassion, and vulnerability in healthcare. For her, these are not only relevant in the direct practice and delivery of medical care, it is also in the system of healthcare delivery, which she puts into practice as the Chief Experience Officer at Cleveland Clinic. In this role, she leads initiatives to address and improve every aspect of a patient's encounter with the Cleveland Clinic health system, from their physical comfort to their educational, emotional, and spiritual needs. These principles and her commitment to truth and ethics are not only relevant to those working in healthcare, but across many disciplines. It is a true privilege to welcome you, Adrienne, to Inspiring Conversations.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Well, I'll give you the floor here for a minute for some opening thoughts, and then we'll get into hopefully a good and fun discussion.
Great. Well, it's always hard to listen to yourself being introduced, but it was such a beautiful introduction by Tom, so thank you. That said, I just want to remind everybody that I'm a normal person whose socks don't match often. And I used to be a bartender, so anything you say, I've definitely heard before. So I welcome engagement and would love to have spontaneous talk rather than hear myself. So it's really a privilege to share a little bit more about what I do and who I am. I still see patients. I take care primarily of multiple sclerosis patients, which is such an absolute gift. It's also very grounding for my job. We spend a lot of time talking about vision and strategy, and being able to sit down with people and see the barriers right in front of them is incredibly important to inform our work and direction and advocacy. And if any of you have cared for a loved one, I don't need to tell you about the work that healthcare has to do. So we've got a lot of work to do to make it easier for people to partner more effectively with patients, to make sure they feel cared about as a human being, and to communicate effectively and keep them safe. Those are some of the top principles in my mind as we try to craft a vision for the future. So thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being with us. I thought the first question might be just, what is it that created enough passion about empathy and client experience that after all the years of training, I know I have a son who's a resident, that it takes to become a medical doctor, that caused you to make empathy and client experience a central part of your career?
Oh, well, you don't start with softballs there at Notre Dame, do you?
I know from our earlier discussion, you're not going to have any problem.
All right, yeah, great. Well, I mean, the official answer would be it's something I've cared about my whole life. The unofficial answer is I grew up in a very dysfunctional family. I had an abusive, alcoholic stepfather, and my father died when I was very young of leukemia. And subsequently, my two subsequent stepfathers died of leukemia as well. And I called the police often to our home. It was a very traumatic time. I was in my formative years, probably like, 11. And I think the questions probably started then, right? Like, why do people behave like you are? Why would you say that to me? Why would you say that to my mother? Why are you behaving that way? I always had those questions in my mind, and I think it's part of that formative path. And then as I went into medicine, it's really interesting. Even when I worked in a bar, I kept looking at people coming in like, well, why are you clustered that way as a group? And why are you using alcohol to start to talk to somebody else? Why don't you just talk to them? It was really, I kept asking all the weird questions. And then when I started thinking about what I wanted to do, I was just fascinated with the human brain and behavior. Went into neurology. I felt that was more black and white and precise than psychology. And all of a sudden, when you hit the floors, you realize when you start seeing patients that it just was incredibly obvious to me that they had no idea what we were talking about some of the time. We didn't always include the people that mattered most. And I found myself going back after we had rounded to talk to patients and families, especially the ones that I was taking care of, to say, did you really get that? Do you understand what that means? I wanted to be the one to tell my patients that they were dying, even though I was the youngest member of the team. So that was a part of that was clearly emerged as a part of who I was. And I think at first I thought it would go away with time because we don't always embrace it, quite honestly, right? It's more about tasks and getting things done and how much do you know. And I was never going to be the best at that. I just accepted that about myself. But I have over time come to embrace this part of who I am and what I bring. And it is a gift. It's not the same gift that others have, but it's something that I have come to appreciate about how I look at the world. And I think that's what got me here. I just kept asking those weird questions, and fortunately was at a place that cared about them too.
So I love, first of all, thank you for sharing that. How do you help others to have that same sort of empathetic approach? It sounds like yours came in part from experience from very young. Not everybody's had that experience. Not everybody's developed that sort of empathy. How do you do that when you work with your fellow clinicians and others throughout the system?
Well, the ideal way to do it is probably not to walk into a room saying to yourself, I'm gonna teach everyone in this room about empathy. That is probably just not where I would start. Over time, I've worked very hard at modeling the behavior I want to see on my team, in the organization, from my colleagues. And I have to tell you, that is one of the hardest things I've ever done, because it's easier to sort of sit back and be like, oh, well, you're not demonstrating empathy. I would have said it this way. I wish you cared about my feelings. And instead, in my world, the most challenging thing that I ask of myself, and I work really hard at it with intention, is to be able to say, well, they're coming from a really different perspective. I'm not hearing what would sound like empathy to me. I wonder if there's a way that I can be more curious or empathic to them. And you and I talked previously in a different conversation that there are some decisions we really don't like in healthcare, or that come from our leaders or partners. And at times when I've been faced with that, it'd be really easy to play the victim and get mad and throw a tantrum. And maybe I do that in private most of the time. But one of my colleagues said to me, well, don't you teach empathy? Aren't you? And I was like, what would it look like if you showed up to this situation with that in mind? And I was like, I'm never talking to you again. I don't like you at all. And but that is the challenge, is in the times when we don't want to be, how can we step into a space of curiosity and empathy for people that we don't like, that don't sound like us, that may not speak like us? What would it sound like to be empathic? What would it sound like to explore their perspective more before I make a judgment about who they are as a human? That I enjoy that space, and I think it's what's needed. So we have other clever ways that we train around empathy. We use a lot of improv. We use a method called sociodrama, where instead of coming with a pre-baked curriculum, you allow the audience to build the curriculum or the scenario based on their pain points. And then we work through it together, which is much more fun than coming with these baked scenarios. I'll give you a good example. What we found was, if you come to a cardiac surgeon to try to teach empathy or communication skills, but your case is about neurosurgery, the cardiac surgeon spends so much time trying to get the facts right, and is so uncomfortable because they don't know anything about neurosurgery, that they miss the whole point that you're just working on setting an agenda, reflective listening, and empathic statements, because all of a sudden they don't want to look like they don't know what they're talking about in front of their peers, and it hijacks their brain and off they go. Right. So oftentimes we actually scrap that whole plan and instead said, tell me about a time where you got stuck. Tell me about a difficult conversation that you've had to have, and let's work there. Which is really great, because that's where empathy begins, right? Imagining what it is to be another in that experience. So that's your official answer.
Well, it didn't sound merely official. In fact, what I take away from that is it's actually an empathic approach to connecting, right? And understanding where the individual is coming from in order to be most effective in helping them. And, if you're comfortable sharing it with the group, you shared what I thought was a wonderful story with me at the beginning of our conversation about how sometimes you'll find yourself, maybe when you're not in kind of your traditional role, but maybe when you're dealing with people in your organization in a more administrative context, that you actually catch yourself not being as empathic as you'd like to be. So is it, and the question there for me to a certain degree, is it kind of contextual? I mean, is it and can it be harder sometimes when you're not in your kind of normal role where you've maybe trained yourself or worked to become more empathic? Is it harder sometimes outside of that, or when dealing with superiors or others, to be as empathic as you try to be in your practice?
Well, I mean, I'd love to hear from the audience on this one. Like, how many times did you practice the exercise of imagining what it's like to be your boss? Right. I mean, that has a lot of different layers to it, right? But like, how many times did you imagine that? The decisions they must be facing, the weight of things, the competing priorities, the maybe inadequate preparation or the background that doesn't quite right. I mean, a lot of times we get handed things that we're not quite prepared to handle.
Right.
And so how many times have we, rather than simply labeled them, and moved on, how many times do we pause to reflect and try to honor what they might be going through? That's a very, and I would say that's higher order difficulty of empathic practice.
Right.
And especially, I think, when you're feeling victimized, or if you're feeling attacked, or it doesn't benefit you, or all of those pain points, right, that could come at you in day-to-day life. That amygdala starts charging up, right? And you get 2 or 3 more hits, and then off you're going to go. And
Right.
that person is just this, and you close the box and never open it again. And that's where we all fall down, right? When I'm not challenging what I believe I know about you or who you are. So in academics, it's all fun to talk about, right? We know we interrupt patients in 11 seconds. We know only 20% of the time in specialty care do we ask for their agenda. That's out of Mayo. Even when you train people, they can only keep themselves quiet for another 5 seconds. We have these incredible urges that are just part of who we are as humans. And it is very interesting, because when we started rolling out our training, we didn't call it patient-centered communication or patient-doctor communication, because the skills are about interacting with other humans. And it doesn't make any sense, right? If you're one version of yourself at work, you're empathic and your patients love you, but then you go into the OR and you throw things, or you go home and yell at your partner because they didn't take out the trash. Like,
Right.
we bringing our whole selves would mean we're the same in these different settings, and our values are the same, right? We don't change who we are, hopefully, depending on what setting we're in. And these skills can help in any setting. Is it a challenge? Yeah, sure. Look at the world today, how easy it is to be angrier,
Right.
and it's shaping all of us, whether you're actively a part of it or not. So build up that muscle, just to sort, what am I feeling? What am I feeling? I wonder why I'm feeling that. What could I do, right? What could I do or say to make sure that person either feels safe continuing to give me feedback about something, or how could I make sure I understand where they're coming from? And sometimes I just don't want to, right? And if I'm sensing that in myself, I need to be like, you know what? I'd love to have this conversation. I need a timeout.
Right.
And take the time you actually need. Honor that in yourself.
Right. Yeah. One other thing that thread that I need to pick up on here a little bit is you had mentioned, kind of where people are coming from, right? And I think that ties it in, but also, and I think that ties a little bit to the biases that people bring to the table. And one of the things I loved about in our earlier conversation was the gender bias component, right? And so maybe talk a little bit about how, maybe it's one of those things that causes that amygdala to fire occasionally, and but and I just thought it was a rich conversation around that and how you deal with that in a world which is probably still more dominated by males than females, right? That you encounter.
I think it's hard to be a woman who has a career and probably not have experienced some version of gender bias. And there are many different biases. So we're just talking about one here. Right. But the brain, to be a neurologist for a moment, right? In some sense, these are meant, there's some components of bias that are probably meant to be protective of you, right? That when you were trying to find your tribe and avoid the striped tiger, right? Your brain developed really good mechanisms to recognize your tribe and what a tiger looks like, so that you didn't perish when you were hunting and gathering. But But what hasn't evolved is that the brain doesn't always need to protect us in those same ways anymore. Right. So even though centuries have evolved, the brain still has that capability to protect. And it's true even of myself. I just told you about my growing up. I had to be really careful because sometimes my amygdala starts firing when I don't need it to. Right. It's just a challenge at work, but it reminds me of something, right, that I may have experienced, and I react differently. I don't show up as my best self. And so what's really important about that amygdala is it's meant to be protective. It's unconscious, right? So it's very difficult to superimpose your rider on that unconscious. And yet we need to start by acknowledging that it exists. And that's why I'm careful when people say they don't have bias, because we all do. We should be curious about what they are, or why we're resonating so much with this person. Why am I not resonating with this person? What is it that's setting me off? And then how do I see around the corner to make sure that I'm doing extra work there? Incredibly difficult. Gender bias, I mean, it's funny, when I was a bartender, I accepted certain behavior. And in part, I had my role to play in it too, right? Because I'm trying to make money. And even though I was doing neurobiological research during the day, right, you know, if I told people who were at the bar that that's what I did during the day, they'd start laughing. And I'd be like, no, really, I did not aspire to make you a Cape Codder. Like, I study mice all day and sequence genomes. Like, that's actually what I do. But nobody, I can assure you, nobody believed that. And you know, it worked for that role that I was in. So I have some responsibility there. I had an idea in my head that that would go away as I got more educated and evolved, right, in my own career trajectory. And it hasn't always gone away. But I have gotten better about addressing it, not in a, oh, look how badly you're treating me, because, right, not from a judgment place, or not from a, but from a, I have to imagine what you're saying right now is not what you're intending, because I'm starting to feel like this is about me as a woman having strong aspirations, but somehow it's becoming about my personality. Or I have said, I'm wondering if you'd be having this conversation with the chief blah, 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 who's a guy. Because this feels very specific. You know, I'm wondering. I don't know. I'm not making a judgment immediately about it, but I am just highlighting that I want to ask this question.
It might be coming from there.
That's right. And giving people the grace and the opportunity to maybe recognize it in themselves. I will say some of the most powerful things in my career have been when people stand up against it. I think you learn a lot about the environments you're in, or the community you really have, when there are those microaggressions, or where are those kind of judgments made. And do we stay silent, or do we speak up? And it doesn't always have to be in that setting, right? Because we want everybody to feel safe. But there are ways to address it, and it's really important that we do.
So one other topic that really resonated with me was the concept of the interplay between truth and compassionate care. And you know, you've talked about that a lot, you've written about it. Maybe I'd love to hear your perspective on that. You know, it is one of those things that I think is complicated, in particular in the healthcare situation and in the direct, you know, kind of physician-patient relationship. What are your thoughts on that? I just thought
well, truth and compassionate care. Are you worried we're not truthful in compassionate care? Or
I'm worried that it isn't always the truth, that sometimes people aren't truthful because they think that's more compassionate. You know, and
yes,
you know, that you know, being transparent about the situation a person finds themselves in isn't always easy for a doctor or another clinician to do, because they feel like maybe that's not truly compassion.
yeah. So I actually want to start where you ended, which is I haven't met a single clinician in my career who doesn't want to be demonstrating compassionate care all the time for their patients. In fact, just today, I had a physician reach out and say they were really frustrated that they were getting messages from a family member who was very frustrated and bordering on inappropriate when they were working so hard to take care of that person's mom, right? So we are invested, and we're not perfect, but we are invested in, and I think the heart's always in the right place. I believe that out of the gates. And what happens is that sometimes I think our identity gets wrapped up in being a good doctor. So who Adrienne is about whether or not she's a good neurologist. And being a good neurologist sometimes means that you're right. And most of the time you probably are, because you went to school for a very long time and you might be right about the medical stuff.
Right.
But the patient and family is also often right about their expertise in their life, in their community, and how their illness fits into their life and impacts all parts of it. So I was very struck when I was training with a phenomenon that I had seen, wherein we often knew the diagnosis was probably psychiatric or not MS. And instead, I saw the practice of telling a patient they had a touch of MS. You cannot have a touch of MS like you cannot be a touch pregnant.
Right.
But when and that situation came up when patients also are invested their identity in a diagnosis. I have lupus, I have X, I have Y. It doesn't have to be just MS, but some patients do come in saying, I have MS, I read online, I think I have all the symptoms, give it to me. You know, let's get started on a medicine. And you can't judge, as a clinician, I have learned, you can't judge intent. So I don't know if that's evil intent, you know, or there's some malingering component to that, or they're really not aware of that connect that they're making with who they are as a person and that disease label. And so when faced with that scenario, when that investment in that label is deeply entrenched in the patient, sometimes the doctor takes the course of, you know, Tom, you're right. You have a touch of MS. And that tends to go really well. Oh, thank you. I knew it. I knew I had that, doctor. But the other conversation about full truth and full transparency is, well, Joe, I took the time to look at all your records. Thank you for bringing them. I can hear clearly that you're suffering and you don't have MS. And that does not go well.
Especially after you've been told you have a touch of it, right?
Well, that's right, because depending on what they've already heard or how that investment has gotten reinforced, you're essentially ripping their identity fabric out, right? And that's why it's so difficult. Because without it, who are they or what's left? And initially I would just rip it off. Like I would just rip the Band-Aid off in my younger days. And now I work harder on the trust side before we have that conversation to really understand what's the fear, what's the suffering, where is it coming from? my best guess, and can we have a conversation where you might believe what I say?
Well, there are so many more things I could ask you about, but you've drawn some great questions out from the audience. So I want to get to some of those. I just can't tell you how many different things are swimming around in my head that I'd love to talk about, because it's such a rich conversation. But the first one comes from Vicky in Maine. And she says she's
I love Maine.
Yeah. She's a smart person. I know her. She lives in a great place. So she's thinking about the entire healthcare experience, both the actual delivery of care, as well as the more kind of business and administrative side, scheduling, billing, insurance issues, compliance, etc. Can you talk a little bit about how all of that fits from a system perspective? Because sometimes the least compassionate component of it seems to be the non-clinical component of it.
Yeah, well, boy, did you hit the nail on the head. So it's absolutely true. So when we have studied and mapped the journey of an inpatient and outpatient specialty care, we've mapped about 3 different diseases in that space. Over and over and over again, you hear it's the front end and it's the back end, because the people in the middle, the docs and the nurses and my care team, are fabulous. And I will forgive some of this because of this, but at some point this really starts to drive people nuts. So I have advocated to the best of my ability to make sure that when we think about patient experience, it's not limited to a setting. It's the whole thing. It needs to be the moment you think of us, or the moment you feel that breast lump, to the hopefully the rest of your life, quite honestly, right? Because we want to earn your trust for life. We want to be there when you need us forever. So it should really never end after that first touch. And we studied access. We're continuing to study access. You may recall in our earlier days, probably one of the first organizations to declare same-day access. So Toby, our CEO at the time, had just said he had heard a single patient story about a gentleman who had urinary retention and couldn't get in. And the next day he made a same-day access mandate across the enterprise. So we had to have operations to support getting in the same day. Didn't mean you'd get your doctor, didn't mean you'd get it in the location you wanted, which is where it starts to get interesting, right? Because people don't just want access, they want it with their doctor in their location.
At the time they want, yeah.
That's right. But nonetheless, it was a strong statement. And we now probably have, I think it's over 1 million visits a year, which are same day. Wow. A couple of years ago, we rolled out 24/7 Express Care online. So you download an app, you can connect with us 24/7, with the idea that, you know, we need to meet you where you are, not you need to trek where we are. And it can't be foam trees that you get stuck in. It can't be hard. So one of my commitments to patients is about making everything easy. It has to be easy. And access is a huge piece. And it's not just a nice to do. I'll wrap it up in just a minute. It's not just a nice to do. In cancer, it changes outcomes, right? So the longer you wait in phone trees or for that appointment, the worse your outcome is. And so we can't afford to have those delays. So the chair of our Cancer Institute doesn't do time to appointment. He does time to treatment. Wow. That's their judge of access. Not when did you get your first appointment? When did you start getting treated for the cancer that we know you have? And that's where our heads need to be. On the billing side, same thing. We use design thinking quite a bit. We studied with our finance colleagues the billing experience. We have a unified bill at the Cleveland Clinic, so you're only going to get one bill, or you're not going to get 8 different bills.
That's a small miracle, yeah.
It seems like a no-brainer, but it's not. And then all the reasons why people don't pay, and it's not just they don't want to pay. right? They've got barriers too. So again, using design thinking in a customer obsessed industry to make sure we really understand what the unspoken and spoken needs are that we need to resolve in terms of operations and process. I call that empathy operationalized, right? It's not just being nice in person, it's fixing all those pain points.
Right. Well, you just said something though, which I think is a pretty radical thing to say about the healthcare industry,
Just
given
one
my
thing?
experience, which is we said a number of things, but the one thing that I'm going to mention is that it's a customer obsessed industry, because I would say that isn't probably consistent with the history of the industry, that it's been customer obsessed. I think in many, there's a lot of history, I think, around healthcare where it was much more maybe practitioner obsessed than it was customer obsessed. So for you to say that is actually a pretty meaningful breakthrough, and I think a very important thing in and of itself. So.
Yeah, and I'm saying it on purpose. I mean, number one, I don't think patients are customers, so I'm being nudgy there, right? They don't always have choice. It's not like shopping at Target, and it can be incredibly vulnerable situation, right? So you've got fear and your own safety might be threatened. That's not the same as any typical consumer. But if you think about the brands, right, that have really defined themselves in the landscape in terms of their customers, it is obsession. They are obsessed. And so I say it provocatively, we have to become obsessed with the people that we serve. And that's our own people as much as it is our patients, and making sure we're designing for them. It's not rampant. I completely agree.
Well, and the other thing which just kind of sticks with me too is you mentioned putting yourself in the shoes of the person you report to, but it also is putting yourself in the shoes of your patients, of your customers, right? I mean, that to me seems, maybe I'm wrong, you know far more about this, but that seems to be at some level kind of the core of empathy, right? Is being able to put yourself in the shoes of the person that you're interacting with, right? And being able to relate to the situation from their perspective, not just your perspective.
That's right. There's this idea that I becomes you, and it's not that you take on their identity or you take on all their problems, but it's that you can sit in that experience through their lens, right? And only then will it start to make you really mad. Maybe sad, maybe happy, but also mad. Because again, as someone who's sat at the bedside of my loved ones, right, you see you won't forget. Or if you try to make an appointment for a loved one. We had the executive team here a couple years ago eat the food that we feed our patients. That's pretty memorable. We go and do the jobs of our caregivers regularly. We have an executive rounding session where we do that. And it changes you, because it's easy sitting way off in a building three buildings over to talk about those chefs over there.
Right.
But when you go do their job and you meet Lisa, who gets up at 4:30 in the morning, right, to come cook for our patients and our people, you'll be telling that story for a long time.
Yeah. So there's some great insightful questions. I just want to remind the audience, even though I can promise you we won't get to all of them, that you can continue to submit them through the link on the chat. But one of the really insightful, they're all insightful, but a great insightful question here from Rick in Pennsylvania is, what are the best strategies to bridge the gap between providing the highest patient experience and the downstream effects on providers? And kind of the sub question here is the potential trade-off of improving access at the expense of work-life balance for providers, and the fact that being empathic probably takes a little more time, and that seems to be one of the challenges in healthcare, is the amount of time that the practitioners can actually spend with the patients.
Yeah, well, I think there's two questions in there, if I'm hearing you right. One is, if we are going to take a human-centered approach to design and solving these problems, then our clinicians are a stakeholder. I mean, that is why I don't use the term patient-centered. I use the term people-centered or human-centered or relationship-centered, because it's not all about one or the other. If we have a ton of super engaged patients that have a ton of access and our clinicians are the walking dead, we have failed. That's a failure.
Right. It's not
And so
sustainable.
one doesn't win without the other. And quite honestly, patients would give us that grace, right? You created access, but my doctor was miserable. They see it and they'll hear it. And we don't want that for anybody. The precious thing, the secret sauce, which I'll share and ask you not to tell anybody, is that, and this took me a long time to grow into my own practice. The patients aren't something for us to do. They are why we are here. And they offer an antidote to burnout and aggravation and frustration that many of us have in our systems or environments. Because it's not you that gets burned out. The evidence says it's the system, right, that creates barriers to you being your full self. And that's what creates burnout in many clinicians. But the patient and that relationship with the patient is part of the antidote. The burnout literature says if 20% of your work is spent in meaning, that burnout rates will be lower. And that's Tate Shannonfeld out of, now he's at Stanford, was at Mayo previously. So think about that. How do doctors and nurses get meaning in their work? Well, the answer every single time is in my relationships with the patients. Every single time. Maybe on occasion it's innovation, but nearly every single time it's the relationship with the patient. And why is that? It's because those relationships are therapeutic to us. They benefit both parties, right? And they can often heal some of that pain and frustration. All of the evidence, if you want an evidence-based conversation, suggests that compassion and empathy will save you time. What happens when you don't acknowledge emotion in the room is one of two things. The patient stops talking and they're never coming back to you. Or they escalate. So let me give you a quick example. Hi, patient. I'm Dr. Boissy. It's great to see you. Last time we talked about you quitting smoking. Yes, doctor, but it's been hard. I really haven't been able to make any progress. Well, why not? My mom died a month ago, and I just can't quit right now. That's too bad. But if you don't stop smoking, you're going to die of a heart attack too. Now, that's less than a minute. But how do you think that patient feels about that conversation? Yes. If you say to that clinician, hey, what are you trying to convey? I'm wondering what you're trying to convey. They'll say, well, that I care about the patient and I don't want him to die. Right. And then we say, well, could you just try saying that? Right. Just try that instead. And that sounds like, hi, Mrs. Jones, great to see you again. Last time we were talking about quitting smoking. Yeah, doc, I just can't. My mom died. Oh my gosh, I'm so incredibly sorry. Tell me a little bit about how that's impacted you. Once you address that, it's not going to come up again. Right? So it is a time saver because the patient won't keep looking and seeking for you to address it. Right. That pain that they keep bringing. Address it the first time you hear it, and then you can move on.
Right. So is the corollary to, you said the patients are the reason why you're here, and that can be outplayed. It just strikes me that the corollary is also, one would hope anyway, that caring for patients is the reason people chose the profession that they chose, right? So it should tap into something really deep, right, for the practitioners, because that ultimately is why they're there, right? I mean, or why they chose the profession. There's other reasons people choose professions, but at its core, right? I mean, so it really does make sense to me that, by being able to have the meaning that comes from doing what you've chosen to do and to do it as powerfully as you can, it can be really valuable. So it really does resonate.
But I do want to call out to the person who asked the question that what we're saying is that you went into it with this beautiful intrinsic motivation and intent.
Right.
And then stuff started happening. Your schedule got cut to 10 minutes. You can't visit with your patients like you wanted to. Now the burden is piling up of administrative, garbage, and now you're not getting home till, right? So what it is, a system that begins to remove us, in my belief, from who you want to be and who you are. And that creates so much cognitive dissonance for people that it creates suffering for them. Right. And another tip is that the same skills that help alleviate the suffering of our patients work for you. And in the course, when we train, we don't start with, you should be doing blah, 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 blah. We ask, did you sleep last night? Were you on call? Have you lost a patient in the last 24 hours? Where are you coming in today? Because if we come in with jazz hands and improv skills and you are suffering, that's on us. Right. Because as empathy amplifiers, we just messed up within about 30 seconds. So right. I want to honor that about where that comment came from.
Yeah. So not everybody has the privilege of working in an organization that has somebody like you. Are there places that you would recommend, or books or people like Tate that you would recommend that they can go to kind of, learn more, maybe people that you've learned from, so that they can hone their skills? A lot of the questions revolve around that. Clearly, this is resonating. And I can tell from looking at this, there's a lot of doctors on the call here too, that I think they'd love to know, how can they gain some of the insights beyond what we're able to cover in an hour?
Sure. Well, I'm happy to send you my top 10.
That would be wonderful.
You can gladly share. I mean, some things that really have I think helped me. I don't know if they're books. I spend most of my free time with my family, so I can't say I'm an avid reader. Although in this academic smart session, it sounds like I should. I think, so I'm, Adam Grant, I think, is a spectacular resource at Wharton. He writes a lot about organizational dynamics and psychology. He wrote a book. I'm on the advisory board for Option B, which is Sheryl Sandberg and Adam Grant's book about grief, her own journey with grief. And that book was enlightening as to what not to say to people. We wrote a book about communication as well that I'm happy to share, which is really about some of the defaults people have in their language, that we like to say things like, don't worry. That's not an effective empathy phrase. We like to say things like, I understand. That's not an effective empathy phrase. So just being cognizant, saying, I really want to be empathic, but I don't have time. Using the word but is a please stop. So practice in your language. I want to be empathic and I will find the time. I want to be empathic and I feel challenged by the time pressure, right? Because we don't want to negate ourselves in our messages. So some of those quick tips are in the book. I also think absorbing anything you can. I mean, there are several resources for communication out there. Vital Talk is one of them for clinicians. They do a great job. There's the American Academy of Communication in Healthcare. They do a great job. Other good books, I mean, Brene Brown is fabulous, of course. Those are some off the top of my head. But the secret, I mean, the thing that I have resonated with the most is finding a few people who believe as you do. Because then you won't feel like the weirdo I have sometimes felt. So even if you're not at a place with a fancy chief experience officer, if you have a few friends or a few colleagues who believe as you do, to advocate for these types of learnings, teachings, process changes to make your life easier and more enriching, as well as for those of your patients and colleagues. I mean, that's a life worth living, whether you're a chief experience officer or not.
So one of the things you said to me when we talked, which just you just brought to mind, which I loved, it was embrace your weirdness. I must have gone weird on you in the conversation, but so you said, you said maybe you are just well, maybe the message there is it's okay to be kind of weird sometimes, right? If that kind of makes things work, is that what underlies that, or something else? I just thought that was such a
there are lots.
It made me feel good at the end of the conversation. I'm not quite sure why, but
well, there are lots of different. I don't wish for any of you to feel like you don't fit in or you might be weird, right? Because it's not always a great feeling and it's not always celebrated. Right. But I guess I aspire to a place where we do feel psychologically safe enough to bring different opinions and our own experience to the table. And because wouldn't it be fun to actually have those inclusive conversations where we admired how you were so different than I, as opposed to trying to get everybody to see the world like you do? Right. It sounds initially great, which is why affinity bias exists. Oh, that's a great idea. That's also mine. But it's going to be richer and we'll have broader support for ideas that aren't just ours. And I saw a great, if you're interested in someone's journey around that, this chief marketing officer of Netflix has a great message about how she has been loud and wild in her own life, whether it was at Pepsi or Netflix, and that wasn't always embraced either. Right. But we all have a choice about whether we're going to stuff that version of ourselves in a box and not open it up again, or we're going to go with it. We're going to bet on ourselves. And I think more and more I'm making the choice to try to bet on myself. Does it work for everybody? Absolutely not. Can I adjust and pivot and learn? Absolutely. But I can't change what I fundamentally value and believe in. And I don't want to.
Right. So I'm going to combine a few questions for the last question that we have time for. And it gets
this is a tough crowd.
Yeah, it's a great, I mean, it's just a testament to you, to be very honest, that the kinds of questions that are emerging here, they raise so many fun and interesting topics that are really important. But it's about, how do you find a safe space, right? You're a leader, you're doing this all day. What do you do to recharge and to, is there a safe space that you have, and is there advice you give to others around finding a safe space when maybe something is triggered, or you can't find that kindred soul at work?
Sure. Well, one, I'm a huge Prince fan. So I am the person jamming in my car all the way to work and all the way home, blasting Prince. I could listen to books on tape, but that's just part of how I psych myself up for my day, and I have a little bit of fun and put myself in a good headspace. I appreciate that he could play 27 instruments before he was 20.
Right.
And that's someone who really walked his own path. Right. I also, when I walk out of this building, I literally, as I'm on the stairwell, I say to myself, how lucky I am, out like in my brain, how lucky I am to be walking out today when so many others can't. I say that. Another one of my colleagues makes a practice of taking off her white coat before she leaves and donning it back on because of the weight of it sometimes. I remember my children's faces when they don't care what job I have and they think I'm horribly uncool. You know, that is very grounding for me to roll in the grass and pretend like I know how to play football. I look for those anchors to keep helping me to go on, because there are days where it's hard, and I don't show up like this every day. I may look put together to you, but you've only known me for an hour, and I think it's something we have to constantly invest in, is finding those little things to just keep going a little further. Old high school friends are one of the best, right? Because they probably know all those stories you wish nobody knew about you. And I sometimes need to be reflected to myself through somebody else's eyes. So I'm picking up the phone and making sure I'm more intentional about that on occasion. Those are some of the things I do, but no one can dictate those for you, right? We know those types of things are really important to find ritual and space for yourself.
Well, I think you should feel wonderful because you did what you said you want to do in your practice, and you modeled all those things that, at least I think, are so wonderfully connected with compassion and care, everything, a vulnerability from the beginning of the story, telling us, giving us different behaviors that we can model, habits that we can have, being very human. It really was wonderful. And I just cannot thank you enough. We had the great pleasure of starting this whole series, and this just struck me during the conversation with Dr. Penny Wheeler. And now we have the great pleasure of having you. And I think, it just shows that, in industry, which I think all too often, given my connection with the industry as well, it just, people don't get an opportunity to see the just really spectacular people that populate it and are really looking to create the kind of transformation that we've had the opportunity to witness you and to walk on what has only been a 1 hour journey with you. And we'd all love to have you longer, but just thank you. Thank you for being all that you were during the course of the conversation today. It was really spectacular. And I know people will walk away with a lot of insights, and most importantly, maybe just a little different mindset, which will cause them to go in different directions. So I just really want to thank you. I also want to thank everybody that joined us today. And I hope that everybody else found it to be as insightful and inspiring as I did. It was truly wonderful. And I want to remind everybody that this conversation and the others that we've had during the course of the year will be available on the ILI website, as well as the ThinkMD site over time. And I know, based on this conversation, you're going to not only inspire those people that were on the call here today, but a number of other people that this will get translated across to. I've had the pleasure of speaking to the head of the Compassionate Care Study at Notre Dame, Dr. Dominic Vachon, and he was so excited that you were coming on, and I'm sure he's even more thrilled now. So
my Compassionate Care challenge to everybody is no one will know that you listened to this talk today.
Yeah.
So they won't have any idea that your mindset may have moved a little to the right or to the left. And it's not me, it's incumbent upon all of us, one small gesture tomorrow, maybe towards someone you don't resonate with, and see where that takes you. I bet it'll feel surprisingly good. Yeah. So thank you so much for having me. My honor, absolutely.
Yeah, well, it was our honor, actually, and a privilege. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, everybody.